Europe is filled with myths and legends about ancient civilizations that were said to have existed long ago, but met their demise, often because of some great cataclysmic event. The most obvious example is the story of Atlantis, made famous by Plato, but a term that existed before Plato's time, as it was also used by Herodotus. Other legends speak of inhabited regions to the north, such as Hyperborea, which allegedly was populated by a race of giants who lived beyond the north wind. We find similar stories of giants and cataclysms all over the world, even mirrored in parts of the Bible. There seems to be endless debate about whether these stories are based in truth or merely allegory. As early as the 12th century, the Irish believed in the existence of a strange island that could be viewed along the west coast of Ireland once every 7 years. There was an oral tradition of telling stories about an island in a fog bank or a floating island that would disappear when people approached it. Later, the stories were printed in books about Irish folklore. The text you're looking at is a chapter from a book titled Irish Wonders, published in 1888. It includes tales about ghosts, giants, demons, leprechauns, banshees, fairies, witches, old maids, and other marvels of the Emerald Isle. It's a story about an enchanted island that was allegedly visible to inhabitants of County Cork on July 7, 1878. The island vanished and would later appear periodically off the west coast of Ireland. There continues to be widespread interest in the mythological island. The name High Brazil originated from Celtic mythology. According to Irish folklore, an island named High Brazil was visible from the west coast of Ireland for only one day every 7 years. The rest of the time it was obscured by fog. Irish poet Gerald Griffin describes it like this: "On the ocean that hollows the rocks where ye dwell, a shadowy land has appeared, as they tell. Men thought it a region of sunshine and rest, and they called it High Brazil, the Isle of the Blest. From year unto year on the ocean's blue rim, the beautiful spectre showed lovely and dim. The golden clouds curtained the deep where it lay, and it looked like an Eden away, far away." An island named Brazil was shown on maps of the Atlantic Ocean for centuries, with the earliest being a chart by Spanish cartographer Angelino Dolcart in 1325. Venetian cartographer Andrea Bianco placed an island named Insula de Brasil on a chart in 1436. Most mainstream historians believe that mapmakers placed the Phantom Island on their charts after hearing rumors about its existence. But since many failed expeditions were launched to find the island, they have concluded that the island never existed. Although it was never found, Brazil Island continued to appear on maps until at least 1873. This is a detail from a map created by Spanish cartographer Diego Gutierrez in 1562. The island is named Isola de Brazil. It is located southwest of Ireland and east of the sea monster. This map is published in 1570 by Abraham Ortielis. An island named Brazil is shown west of Central Ireland. It's situated right under the image of Europa, after whom the continent of Europe is named, sitting on a bull. In Greek mythology, Europa was the mother of King Minos of Crete and the Phoenician Princess from the Phoenician port city of Tyre, which is in modern-day Lebanon. Incidentally, according to the Bible, King Hiram of Tyre helped King Solomon build the temple in Jerusalem. The Hiram Abiff myth is also used in secret Freemason initiations. In Homer's Iliad, dated to around 8th century BC, Europa is kidnapped by Zeus, who decided to seduce or rape her. In Greek mythology, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference. He transformed himself into a tame white bull and mixed in with her father's herds. While Europa and her helpers were gathering flowers, she saw the bull, caressed his flanks, and eventually got onto his back. Zeus took that opportunity and ran to the sea and swam, with her on his back, to the island of Crete. He then revealed his true identity, and Europa became the first queen of Crete. Zeus later recreated the shape of the white bull in the stars, which is now known as the constellation Taurus. It's interesting that cave art attributed to Cro-Magnon, created during the Pleistocene, or Ice Age, also seems to depict astrological scenes with a bull representing the constellation of Taurus and the Pleiades right behind it on its back, which I write about in one of my books and will cover in a future video. That said, according to Herodotus, Europa was kidnapped by Greeks who were seeking to avenge the kidnapping of one of their princesses from the Peloponnese, a region of Greece that was ruled by the Spartans. Her name was Io, one of the mortal lovers of Zeus, an ancestor of many kings and heroes such as Perseus and Heracles, and astronomers even named a moon of Jupiter after her in 1614. Of course, Europa is also a moon of Jupiter, and Jupiter is the Roman name for Zeus. The ancients connected Io with our own moon, and in the Prometheus myth, she refers to herself as the Horned Virgin. Zeus also lusted after her, and she initially rejected his advances, so in some versions of the myth, he turned her into a cow. While these stories allude to astrotheology, they're also part of the ancient mystery schools, which have to do with harnessing and transmutation of romantic energy from a raw form into a more refined form of energy known as prana, chi, ki, or vril. This can be said for any ancient myth that involves horns. In the ancient mystery schools, it's really about converting lust and animal desires into spiritual life force and enlightenment. Back to High Brazil. And here's a detail from a nautical chart made in 1630 by Portuguese cartographer João Teixeira Albornoz. The island is shown with a circular shape in the lower left corner. It's divided in half by a river and named do Brasil. As maritime traffic increased, cartographers began to doubt the existence of Brasil Island. This image is a detail from a map that was published in 1753 by British cartographer Thomas Jeffries. The island is shown southwest of Ireland as the imaginary Isle of O Brasil. High Brazil was sometimes identified as a rock. Here is a detail of a map that was published in 1769 by French cartographer Guillaume de l'Isle. The island is named Rocker de Brasil, meaning Brasil Rock. It is located beneath the lower left side of the title cartouche. Some believe the name Brasil stems from a Celtic word bres, meaning to bless, and that the island was named High Brazil, or Island of the Blessed. It is not, however, the only use of Brazil to donate an Atlantic island. For example, the 1351 Medici Atlas denotes two islands of Brazil, one placed traditionally off Ireland and the other in the Azores archipelago. The Brazil in this case could be referenced either to the island's volcanic complex or to dragon's blood, a valuable red resin dye found on the island. Dragon's blood is very bright red, and it's obtained from different species of a number of distinct plants and in continuous use since ancient times as varnish, medicine, incense, and dye. Of course, one can't ignore the name of the largest nation in South America, which is also called Brazil. And when one looks into the etymology of its name, It's generally agreed upon that it likely comes from the Portuguese word for Brazil wood, a tree that once grew plentifully along the Brazilian coast. In Portuguese, Brazil wood is called pau-brasil, and the word Brazil commonly given the etymology red like an amber, as Brazil wood produces a deep red dye that was highly valued by European textile industry and was the earliest commercially exploited product from Brazil. Of course, this brings us back full circle to Europa, the Phoenician princess, as Phoenician was not what they called themselves, but a word the Greeks used to describe them, which means red, and also shares roots with the word phoenix, which in Greek mythology is the son of Agenor, a Phoenician king of Tyre, who Herodotus estimates lived sometime before the year 2000 BC. According to Greek mythology, Agenor was born in Memphis of Egypt to Poseidon and Libya, and he had a twin brother named Belus. Belus remained in Egypt and reigned over Egypt, while Agenor departed to Phoenicia and reigned there. It's interesting to note that the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Phoenicians, and the ancient Minoans, which is the civilization that inhabited Crete, where Europa was allegedly taken to, were all depicted in ancient art as having painted the skin of their men red. These ancient civilizations also revered the snake, whether it be the Minoan snake goddess that holds a serpent in each hand, symbolizing the sacred energy of enlightenment, or the Egyptian pharaohs, who are sometimes depicted with a serpent on their forehead, or the Phoenician serpent priest, who is echoed in the god Dionysus and is represented by a wand, a staff, or later a caduceus. We know the Phoenicians would sail to northern Europe to obtain tin, which they mixed with copper to create bronze. There are many examples of customs linking the Celtic Druids with the Phoenicians. While I can't mention many of them here because they involve ritualistic rites which are censored on this platform, including sacrifice, I can mention that the Druids were also known to be associated with serpent symbology, and it's this same symbolism that comes down to us in the story of St. Patrick, who rid Ireland of snakes, even though Ireland has never been known to have any snakes on it during the entire Holocene. There should be a link in the description to a video I made on the subject, where I call the serpent people the generic term pagan, and I said I would make a future video elaborating on their identity. In 1772, General Charles Vallancey, a leading Irish scholar of the day, published his famous work, Essay on the Antiquity of the Irish Language. In his opening remarks, he states, "On a collation of the Irish with the Celtic, Punic, and Phoenician languages, the strongest affinity will appear. It may therefore be deemed a Punic-Celtic compound. From the Canaanite proceeded the Phoenician, from the Phoenician, Carthaginian, or Punic was derived from Aeolian, Dorian, and Etruscan, and from these was formed the Latin. Of the Roman Saxon capital letters, the Irish use but 3. All the others bear a great resemblance to the primitive Canaanite and Phoenician." The division of time into a 7-day week was practiced by Irish Celts, identical to the Phoenicians. Keep in mind the Egyptians had a 10-day week, the Romans and Etruscans had an 8-day week, the Maya had 2 week lengths of 13 days and 20 days, so the number 7 is noteworthy, especially since the High Brazil legend states it is only visible 1 day every 7 years. Irish history records 3 main waves of colonization to that isle in ancient times, but there were likely more, and they probably went back to a time predating many of the myths themselves. The Maritime Archaic, or Red Paint people, were a North American culture complex along the coast of Newfoundland, the Canadian Maritimes, and northern New England, which began in approximately 7000 BC, over 9,000 years ago. The culture consisted of sea mammal hunters in the subarctic who used wooden boats and engaged in long-distance trade from northern Europe to Canada and the eastern US as far south as Maine. Their civilization lasted until the time of Columbus, but high susceptibility to Eurasian diseases and European persecution pushed them inland and away from the fish and marine mammals that had been a staple of their diet. They disappeared in the 1800s as a distinct tribe, but were recognizable by the red ochre used on their burial sites and red paint applied to their skin, which is where the term redskins comes from. Archaeogenetic research in 2017 established that the Maritime Archaic, or red paint people, had nothing in common with the Inuit or other indigenous tribes who later inhabited the same area. A study published in Current Biology compared the mitochondrial DNA of 17 individuals, 13 Beothuk, 53 Maritime Archaic, and 2 Paleo-Eskimo, and found that these populations were not at all related, but instead, the Maritime Archaic had genetic affinities with the Basque people, who are between Spain and France, who have among the highest concentration of Rh-negative blood type in the world, a trait also shared by many people in Ireland. That said, one can only wonder if this belief in the existence of High Brazil gave rise to some of these ancient transatlantic voyages, and if there indeed did exist a once inhabited island which is now submerged below the waves. There's no doubt that seafaring civilizations could reach such a place, if it existed. And in addition to rising sea levels since the last ice age, this part of the North Atlantic also contains complex geology with numerous fault systems which are susceptible to land rising and falling, especially from the pressures caused by the Mid-Atlantic Ridge spreading, which also happens to be the most likely location for Atlantis, around the present-day Azores Islands. While the online consensus seems to be that the island was a fictional place, described as a sort of pagan myth meant to be someplace one goes in the afterlife, I happen to have a gut feeling that the old map makers took their craft seriously and would not portray a landmass on their maps if they did not have a degree of certainty that it existed. So I decided to investigate for myself with Google Maps, using the old maps as a general guide to see if I could detect any elevated areas off the coast of Ireland. It seems that the shape is portrayed as circular, with a canal running through it. I also noticed another island to the southwest of where High Brazil is supposed to be located, and on this map it's called Las Medus. You can see it here below the sea monster and above the Azores Islands. So by the looks of the elevated ocean floor and the distance from the mainland, I decided to start searching in this area, trying to see if I could find anything that would be above sea level or shaped like the images from the old maps. Zooming in a bit, I still couldn't detect anything, but if it's there, this seems to be the correct area to look in. Once I zoomed in more, I noticed something, and not only is it in the exact spot that High Brazil was said to be, there was also another object below it resembling the other island Las Medus. I decided to play with the contrast a bit to see if I could get a better look. Yes, I definitely see something that not only looks round, but has a crease running in the middle, just like on the old maps. I played with the settings some more, and this image is the best that I could get it, and in my opinion, that is it. The maps and the Irish legends were true. I wasn't surprised, as I've come to learn that the ancient wisdom holds much truth, and modern mainstream academia and the media is either corrupt and dismissive, or so arrogant that they ignore any myth, legend, or folklore out of hand without even investigating and looking for themselves. That said, There should also be a link in the description to a video I did about Doggerland, another area now submerged, which some have called the Atlantis of the North Sea, that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. It was flooded by rising sea levels around 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, which may have involved legends from the Frisians, another amazing piece of European prehistory which is never taught in schools, especially after World War II, but I've also covered in a video, as I'm afraid the truth contained in these ancient stories is being deliberately covered up, and history is being systematically replaced by a group only interested in pushing a political agenda. Thank you for giving me some of your time, and thank you to those who share my videos as I rely on word of mouth. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. My published work is available on Amazon. My books make a great gift. If you'd like to support my work, you can do that through patreon.com. There should be a link in the description section for those who are interested. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. Please hit the like button and subscribe for future updates. As always, I look forward to reading your thoughts, so kindly leave me a comment below. Please have a wonderful weekend, and I hope to see you again soon. Water plays an important role in many legends and myths. In an alchemical context, water represents the female or goddess energy. Thales of Miletus was one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, remembered primarily for his cosmology based on water as the essence of all matter, the substance of which all material objects were composed, claiming that water was the origin of all things, and from which all things emerge, and to which they return. There are many mythological water beings and gods, stories of heroes that have something to do with water, and even stories of islands and submerged continents lost below the surface. A few meters below the surface of the water, next to a sandy beach in southern Peloponnese, Greece, lie the archaeological remains of one of the oldest known submerged cities in the world. Pavlo Petri, named after a modern settlement, was a Bronze Age city that was likely submerged around 1000 BC and was one of the first Mediterranean access points for what would later become Europe, which incidentally is named after a Phoenician goddess, Europa. It played a vital role in the beginnings of Western civilization, with surviving archaeological remains including the traces of buildings, courtyards, streets, and burial places. A recent research project examined thousands of fragments of objects on the seafloor, from ordinary tableware to large Minoan jars. Originally, the ruins were dated to the Mycenaean period, which is from 1600 to 1100 BC, but later studies showed an older occupation date of around 2800 BC, which includes early Bronze-aged, Middle Minoan material. It is now believed that the town was submerged by the first of 3 massive earthquakes, and since the area never re-emerged, it was neither built over nor disrupted by agriculture. Although eroded over the centuries, the town layout is as it was thousands of years ago, which includes at least 15 buildings about 4 meters below the water. From the many loom weights found at the site, archaeologists have established that the town was the center of a thriving textile industry, and there were also many large potteries discovered from Crete, indicating it was also a major trading port. And it was an important epicenter of religious worship as well, based on the remnants of some beautifully constructed stone temples. The city of Pavlo Petri is part of the underwater cultural heritage as defined by UNESCO, as all traces of human existence underwater, which are 100 years old or more, are protected, which is good as the site is under threat of damage by boats dragging anchors, as well as by tourists and souvenir hunters. The Gulf of Cambat, also known as Gulf of Cambay, is a bay on the Arabian Sea coast of India and is the location of controversial findings made in December 2000 by the National Institute of Ocean Technology. The structures and artifacts discovered there are the subject of contention, as they indicate the existence of very ancient submerged city-like structures. One piece of wood that was recovered at the site was dated to 7,500 BC, but some prominent mainstream archaeologists reject the findings as it was recovered by dredging, rather than during controlled archaeological excavation. Dredging implies using a giant machine to scoop out material, which can be very destructive to artifacts and therefore is not considered very scientifically valid in terms of dating. That said, studies performed using sonar describe the area as containing regularly spaced geometric structures at a depth of 30 to 40 meters. India's Union Minister for Human Resource Development, Science and Technology Division, Murali Manohar Joshi, indicated that the ruins of this ancient civilization represented an urban settlement that predates the Indus Valley civilization. Further descriptions of the site by Joshi describe it as containing regularly spaced dwellings, a granary, great baths, a citadel, and a drainage system. So if he's correct, that makes it over 4,600 years old. A follow-up investigation was conducted in November 2001, which recovered a piece of wood, pottery shards, weathered stones, initially described as hand tools, fossilized bones, and a tooth. This time, the piece of wood was carbon dated at an age of 9,500 years old as well. Excavations in 2002 to 2003 found more artifacts, including pottery, microliths, wattle and daub remains, and hearth materials. Wattle and daub is a composite building method used for making walls and buildings, in which a woven lattice of wooden strips called wattle is daubed with a sticky material, usually made of some combination of wet soil or clay or sand and straw. Wattle and daub has been used for at least 6,000 years and is still an important construction method in many parts of the world. These artifacts were sent for dating at Oxford University and were composed of locally available clay, reed, husk, pottery pieces, and pieces of freshwater shell, and also showed evidence of partial burning. Dating came back at an average of around 7,500 BC, and dates this old upset conventional theories, so are obviously contested, as mainstream academia is not that concerned with scientific correctness as they are about political correctness, and pushing a pre-existing political ideology that was established following the Second World War. Heraklion was an ancient Egyptian city located near the mouth of the Nile, about 20 miles northeast of Alexandria, under about 30 feet of water. A stele found on the site indicates that it was one single city known by both of its Egyptian and Greek names. Heraklion is its ancient Greek name, and it was also known by its Egyptian name Thonis, and sometimes called Thonis Heraklion. Its legendary beginnings go back to as early as the 12th century BC, and it's mentioned by ancient Greek historians as its importance grew as the power of the pharaohs waned. The city was said by Herodotus to have been visited by Paris and Helen of Troy before the Trojan War began. According to Herodotus, a great temple was built on the spot where Hercules first arrived in Egypt. The city was a trading port and featured a large temple to Khonsu, son of Amun, who was known to the Greeks as Heracles, who was the son of Zeus. Amun and Zeus are both the same, astrotheologically speaking, as the planet Jupiter, whose 12-year orbit around the sun and path along the night sky, along the constellations, is the basis for our 12 zodiac signs and the mythology that goes with it. Seafaring civilizations used the stars to navigate, and memorizing these stories were imperative to being able to know which way you were sailing in the dark black night. Of course, astronomy also played a key role in divination, as the stars held cyclical patterns by which ancient civilizations timed their rituals, which involved sacred acts which are still being performed by many secret societies until this day. During the time when the city especially flourished during the 6th and 4th centuries BC, a large temple of Amun was located in the middle of the city, and sacred rituals involving the goddess were conducted there on solstices, equinoxes, and other important occasions. Sanctuaries at Heraklion dedicated to Osiris and other gods were famous for miraculous healing and attracted pilgrims from a wide area. The city was the site of celebrations of the mysteries of Osiris each year, and I'll be releasing a video soon which will describe these occult rites in detail, which, as I said, are still performed in modern times by many of the elite who participate in ancient occult rituals but prefer to keep it secret and below the surface, like many of these forgotten ruins at these ancient sites. That said, I'd like to close this presentation off with a brief talk I stumbled upon which humorously attempts to shed a bit more light on the rise and fall of this ancient forgotten city.
Hello. What? Sorry, I didn't hear that, so I can't make a snappy comeback. I'll pop right in. In 1933, an intrepid British Royal Air Force pilot named Captain Cull spotted an undersea lion lying underneath the waters a few kilometers off the coast of Egypt. Note that Egypt was at the time a British protectorate, quote unquote, after World War I. So that's what he was doing flying around there at the time. The spot we are talking about is called Abu Qir Bay, about 30 kilometers east of Alexandria. Map. The line that he saw was probably not lime green, but this is an extremely public domain image. What he saw appeared to be a series of structures, a temple wall, as it later turned out, which had long ago slipped down into the bay. Well, you sure don't see that every day, evidence of an underwater civilization. And this was in 1933, long, long before Erich von Däniken and Chariots of the Gods, and this guy, and the Bermuda Triangle craze. Those things were way off in 1933. So Captain Cull had no reason to doubt that when he saw a structure under the water, he was looking at a bit of human civilization, not a UFO base. So he passed on his report right away when he got back down on the ground. And almost immediately afterward, nothing whatsoever happened for 60 years. Why was there no follow-through on this? Well, things were complicated at the time. I mean, Italy was invading Ethiopia next door. There was the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936, which limited British power in Egypt. And there was also a lot of invasive archaeology happening in Egypt at the time in the form of Harrison Ford fighting Nazis over the Ark of the Covenant. So it was a busy time. In normal circumstances, if somebody says, hey, I found a city that appears to be down at the bottom of our bay, everybody wants to hear more about that, and Mediterranean civilizations in general that are lost. A couple of quick examples. The city of Gnosis in Minoan, Crete. Perhaps the oldest discrete civilization known to have existed in Europe. It went missing sometime after the 1-2 punch of an invasion out of a 1500 BCE volcano, and was not rediscovered until the very first bit of the 20th century, which is a long time to go dark. Or the much, much better known pornographic graffiti haven of Pompeii. It disappeared after the 1-1 punch of the Vesuvius eruption in 79 CE. The eruption... This eruption probably inspired a line of imagery in the book of Revelation. The second angel blew his trumpet, and a mountain all ablaze was thrown into the sea. So this event sure was no secret, but after a generation or two, and almost up to 1600 CE, Pompeii's location got lost. And of course, there is Atlantis, this is the available image of it. Atlantis may have been in the Mediterranean, or more appropriately in the Atlantic, or under Dodgers Stadium, or on the dark side of Alderaan. Lost Mediterranean civilizations, real ones or fictional ones, carry plenty of romance. But the one that I'm here to talk about tonight, the lost city of Heraklion / Thonis, is maybe less like a vanished metropolis and a little bit more like what people of the year 2400 are going to find when they dig up the MacArthur Maze from the bottom of the Alta California Sea. Give it time, it'll come. I don't describe Heraklion this way to diminish it, but to frame it as a port of call and a harbor complex standing on the islands and sandbars of a wetland. Think very vaguely of Treasure Island and Angel Island, plus Alcatraz and the Dumbarton Bridge and some landfilly spans of the Embarcadero Piers. For hundreds of years, this harbor complex at the mouth of the Nile was the public face of Egyptian commerce with the rest of the known world. 300 years before Alexandria was founded, this was the flag Egypt hung out to the Mediterranean. So, smash cut to this amazing guy. After that 60-year lull following 1933, enter Frank Gadito, employed internationally as a government mathematician / economist until his early 40s. He decided to jump into a second career in undersea archaeology. It's a very easy transition to make career-wise. I am always getting the impression from Gadito of one part Jacques Cousteau, one part Buckminster Fuller, one part Tony Robbins. He's a big self-promoter, but in a way hard not to admire. Springing into action with a grinding half-decade of methodical seafloor scanning, funded by who else? Liechtensteinian tool-making magnates, the Hilties. Gadito mapped 110 square kilometers of the seabed in Aboukir Bay before ever digging up a single thing. There's a lot of silt out there. He made maps, that is certainly true. And by 1996, Gadito could be methodical, since there were relatively few Nazis to compete with over interpretations of world history. And I wish that were still so. Sorry. So let's run down what this whole thing's about archaeologically. The Nile, flowing north, of course, spreads into its famous delta in the final approach to the Mediterranean. Overlaying here, I will show where in ancient times the main splits of the river progressed through the delta. Now in 331 BCE, Alexander the Great founded his famous coastal city of Alexandria at the extreme west of the delta. But at that time, there was already a thriving port right next door on the Canopic branch of the Nile at Aboukir Bay, 30 kilometers east of Alexandria. The city was Heraklion, which had been doing well for itself for at least 300 years. We'll see here in this picture the results from all of the bay seafloor scanning that was done. And it shows in tan colors where Gadito showed that solid, or at least mainly above sea level, land used to be. And the next box I'll zoom in onto is the one that contains this schematic diagram of what the Heraklion city complex used to look like. So, of important note to this group tonight is that where you see the blue peppering, like all of that stuff, those are where anchors were found. And where you have anchors, you have some of which were also found in full shippy form too, not just the anchor. These are the larger blue diamonds that you see splashed around. So a good 66 ships have been turned up from around this site. Most of them were scuttled deliberately back in the day. This is a much older map of the bay before any of this work had been done to excavate, and it shows where scholars expected to find Heraklion back on land. And this is probably why I really brought the pointer. They thought it would be there, and that it would be two towns called Heraklion and Thonis, not out in the middle of the sea, but on land, of course, which they thought were two cities sort of that lived cheek by jowl in the same sense as Minneapolis and St. Paul, or Buda and Pest, twin cities. But we now know that Heraklion and Thonis were just the same place, whether under Egyptian versus Greek naming. So nobody could seem to find this place, though. But we knew Heraklion should be someplace because it was mentioned a good 3-4 times in important ancient sources. First of those is the father of history and chatty Cathy, Mr. Herodotus, who never minded passing on false oddities if they interested him, and God bless him for that. So here he is in a statue, and here he is as a character in Assassin's Creed. Which tells you that Herodotus was important enough to be both a statue and a character in Assassin's Creed. Herodotus wrote in the middle 400s BCE and is the man who gave us the genuinely hard-hitting, journalistic, totally real, and unrumored story of what was once called the Battle of Thermopylae and is now better known as this thing. But Herodotus gave us a lot else along the way in his wonderful, weird book, like that griffins and cyclopses are real, let alone these ants he talked about in Persia, big as foxes, that dig up gold dust. So when you hear something from Herodotus, you verify it. But he said there was a city on the canopic outlet of the Nile where not only did the demigod Heracles himself once alight, giving the city its name, and here's Heracles for you in super cool mode, showing you how to dress when you need to fight a lion. Herodotus tells us that this city, named after Heracles, figures in the Trojan War a little bit. When Paris made off with Helen of Troy, who was really from Sparta, just ran to Troy, never mind that. These lovers on the lam were blown by a storm into Heraklion, where they were stuck for a night. They made a sacrifice at the temple of Heracles before going on to Asia Minor to start the Iliad. So that's what Herodotus said. But the takeaway is that there's a port city on the Nile named after and with a temple to Heracles. Let me point out that, boom, the temple of Heracles is that, big thing in the middle there. I can never punch the right button. So, to clean up real quickly, there were other ancient sources about the city. These would include Strabo, whose geography, I will tell you, is ungodly long, and Diodorus Siculus, whose Bibliotheca Historica was also less interesting than Herodotus. Returning to our contemporary hero, Frank Gaudio, years of scanning the seafloor led to years of excavations, turning up all of the incredible, masonry and statues and artifacts that you would expect from this kind of thing, including but hardly limited to boring pottery and hundreds of interesting anchors and 66 ships, this incredible statue they're dragging down the street in Alexandria. These days, the lost city of Heraklion is still pretty far from what you would call famous, but I did bump into the fact that it now is the name of an annual EDM festival in Egypt. Sponsored by Heineken. I have not been able to verify if this festival is organized by the Fire Festival guy, but the potential for disaster seems obvious. The big question is, what the hell happened? We have this buzzing metropolis of ports, temples, custom houses, which conducted the business of the Nile Valley with the world for 1,000 years, vanished. It did lose some prominence over time to Alexandria, but the real story is in a phrase that will have a chilling ring to Bay Area ears, and that is soil liquefaction. Interesting. The word Nazis or the word soil liquefaction get worse? See, if you have water-bearing soils, or if you have landfill or slippy clay, and you set a very heavy structure on it, then it only takes so much tectonically to send the thing underwater. There is some evidence that stragglers were on a couple of islands in Heraklion at the time Islam came to Egypt in the 600s CE. But it was around then that the city's name passed out of history and all memory of its location went dark. People forgot where it had been. No word of a specific catastrophe, and this is more a slow tectonic story than a climate change story, but it was mysteriously forgotten, at least until 1933 when Captain Cull saw it, then it was forgotten again until 96 when Gaudio and his team began to discover the city anew. So let us raise our glasses to him, to their discovering spirit and his team, and to the hope that someday someone will also dredge up from the bottom of the sea all these interesting spots where we live and work today.
My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. My published work is available on Amazon. My books make a great gift. If you would like to support my work, you can do that through patreon.com. There should be a link below in the description. Thank you for those that are interested. I appreciate it very much. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to those that have been sharing these videos, as I rely on word of mouth. So thank you for that as well. Please hit the like button and subscribe for future updates. As always, I look forward to reading your thoughts, so kindly leave me a comment below. Please have a wonderful weekend, and I hope to see you again soon. In actuality, American history is far different from the way it's been presented in modern schools or portrayed on the big screen. Hollywood has a tendency to finance and promote blockbuster movies about historic events, which oftentimes, if not always, camouflages key points with a love story or some other distraction. One example of this is the movie Titanic, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, who put in a great job as an actor, but the film did not do the historic event justice, as it concealed the fact that many influential opponents to the Federal Reserve central banking system lost their lives with the sinking of that ship. I already covered this topic in a video, which I'll include a link to in the description, but it's worth mentioning again, as it was this notorious incident in 1912 which made the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 possible. One of the most influential and popular documents exposing the formation of the Federal Reserve is a book written in 1994 by G. Edward Griffith called The Creature from Jekyll Island, which recounts a secret meeting that took place in 1910 on Jekyll Island, a stretch of white sand beaches and beautiful landscape off the coast of Georgia. It was an exclusive gathering of American financiers, politicians, and banking elite who covertly plotted the draft legislation for the creation of the all-powerful central banking system that not only financed both world wars, but has become an accomplice in the support of totalitarian regimes throughout the world. An excerpt from the book claims that, quote, there are few historians who would challenge the fact that the funding of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War was accomplished by the Mandrake mechanism through the Federal Reserve System. An overview of all wars since the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694 suggests that most of them would have been greatly reduced in severity, or perhaps not even fought at all, without fiat money. It is the ability of governments to acquire money without direct taxation that makes modern warfare possible, and a central bank has become the preferred method of accomplishing that. We theorize a strategy dubbed the Rothschild formula, in which the world's money cabal deliberately encourages war as a means of stimulating the profitable production of armaments and keeping nations perpetually in debt. This is not profit-seeking, it is genocide. It is not a trivial matter, therefore, to inquire into the possibility that our elected and non-elected leaders are, in fact, implementing the Rothschild formula today. While there's been some movements to combat this globalist totalitarian network, which has not only financed communist revolutions around the world, such as in Russia, China, and more recently in South Africa, which were all triggered by engineered social uprisings aimed to remove existing power structures using class warfare and amplifying socioeconomic and racial tensions enforced by a banker-controlled media. We can see the same pattern played out in America today, where manufactured civil unrest is used to erase history and promote cultural Marxism, in a nation which already promotes falsehoods in schools, starting from its name, which was not really based on the explorer Amerigo Vespucci, whose authentic name was actually Alberigo Vespucci, who only changed his name to Amerigo after his voyages to the Americas. In other words, Amerigo came from America and not the other way around. Not only was there an existing tribe in Nicaragua called Americ, whose root word was the ancient name for the land used by the natives of Peru, also known to the Maya civilization and attributed to the great feathered serpent creator deity, which they called Kukulkan, a deity which also had an equivalent by the Aztec civilization. According to Manly P. Hall, in his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, quote, these children of the sun adored the plumed serpent, who was the messenger of the sun. He was the god Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, Gucamet in Quiche, and in Peru he was called Amaru. From the latter name comes our word America. Amaruca is, literally translated, land of the plumed serpent. The priests of this flying dragon, from their chief center, they once ruled both Americas. One of their strong centers was Guatemala, and of their order was the author of the book called Popol Vuh. Many Mesoamerican and Native Indian tribes also record in their oral traditions encounters and conflicts with giants, or at least very tall people in the past. I also covered this topic in several videos, showing documentation regarding many discoveries of giant skeletons, which have been published in newspapers, and then seemingly forgotten to history, except for mythology or mentions of giants in the Bible. In many biblical interpretations, the serpent is synonymous with Lucifer, the fallen angel thrown down by God, which literally translates to light bearer, a symbol which can be found in many parts of the ancient pre-Christian world. In his book, The Occult Connection to the Hidden Race, author Ken Hoodall proposes that, quote, then perhaps the land of the plumed serpent may also be known as the land of Lucifer, concluding that America means the land of Lucifer. While this interpretation may sound like a real stretch for many, it's an interesting concept when considered from the perspective of an interview that I recently stumbled upon, suggested to me by one of my subscribers, which uncovered some interesting details regarding the secretive meeting on Jekyll Island and events that led up to the creation of the Federal Reserve. The gentleman being interviewed is Tim Bentz, and the host of the show is Rob Skiba from a broadcast on Blog Talk Radio titled Canaanite Altars and the Federal Reserve. I'll leave a link to the full interview in the description, but now let's listen to a brief excerpt, and I'll leave it to the listener to draw their own conclusions.
I knew something about Jekyll Island. I had looked at some of the financial issues in the 80s and 90s. I was looking at some of the spiritual applications to financial things, but I really was not up to speed on the history of Jekyll Island. I had just heard it from something. I'd not even read, the book that's called The Creature of Jekyll Island. I'd not even read that book, but I was aware of something about Jekyll Island and financial stuff. So I went in my brother's house, got my computer out, and I just, got on the internet and typed in Jekyll Island, and it's like, what's going on with Jekyll Island? And so I discovered when I got online that the Jekyll Island Club, which was this historical, multi-millionaires country club that had been built in the turn of the century, it had just been remodeled and reopened. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. When I got to the hotel, it was about 9 o'clock at night. And so I went in the restaurant and had a good meal and went to my room and got some rest. And the next morning I went down for breakfast, and a different lady was at the desk, but she had a note for me and said that I had an appointment arranged with the museum director, and that he was blocking out most of the day to spend with me. So I had my breakfast, and then when I went over to meet with him. So I go meet with the museum gentleman. His name is John, and when I go meet with him, I just introduced myself. I told him a little bit about who I was and what I do. We started talking. He was, of course, started out talking about the financial stuff, because this Jekyll Island is where the Federal Reserve banking system was birthed and conceived. And at one time, when it was functioning in the 1900s up to the 20s and 30s, some say 1/3, some say 2/3 of the world's wealth would vacation on that island. Mm-hmm. It was the highest conglomeration of wealth in a single place very often anywhere in the world back in the turn of the century. So it just seems like a little island that's not anything significant at all now, but it's amazing to see the financial side of the history of that spot. And so I'm sitting there looking at some of the things that he's telling, and just thinking about some of the things he's telling me. We went out and walked around, and he showed me some of the cottages that had been restored, and the club itself, and the tennis courts, and they had a pier where the boats would come up, and he's just kind of showing me the grounds, and then we go to the museum. And he's talking a lot about the financial stuff and the guys that built it, and each cottage was, marked and named. Some of them had been restored, some of them didn't exist anymore, but they had like a sign that this is where this one was, and that one was built by J.P. Morgan, that one was Rockefeller's, and, that one was... They had each one of them named. Well, they're all kind of native names, and then they're all, got some kind of plaque on who the financial mogul was that had built them. And they're not really elaborate, luxurious mansions. They're just simple cottages for the most part, which was kind of interesting to know that the richest people in the world built them, and they were very low-key and almost like a, cabin in the woods instead of a luxurious house like you'd expect. And they all had Indian names. So I started asking him about the Indian history of the island, and he lit up. he just was like, that's what he really wanted to talk about because he loved the Indian history. And so he takes me back to the museum, and he said, we got a lot of stuff on the Indians. He said this was actually like the government main community for a tribe of Indians that don't exist anymore. That tribe was called the Timucas. And I said, well, that's interesting. My name's Tim. And anyway, I didn't know anything about the Timucas. I'm from Oklahoma. I've learned a lot of Native history, and I have some Native bloodline, but I did not know anything about the Timucas. So I just asked him, please tell me everything that you can tell me about them. There's something about the natives that I feel like I need to know. So he said, well, the Jekyll Island Club was actually built on top of everything that the Indians had. So they just kind of wiped the village out and built the club on top of it. So wherever the chief's house was, there was a cottage now. Wherever the council house was, there was now the Jekyll Island Hotel. You know? And he said everything that's built and visible today is actually sitting right on top of something that was significant in the Indian village when it existed. So he said the fact that this whole place had to go into ruins and then be rebuilt and become an archaeological state park, he said it actually helped us identify the native history because the club itself had almost erased that. You know? And so I said, well, let's look at the museum. I want to see some of the Indian stuff. So we're looking at arrowheads and spear tips and, just artifacts that they had found and pottery shards and things and seashells that they had had. And he showed me all their stuff in the museum. He shows me some fragments of a weapon that was like an unusual bow. And when I say unusual, I mean that it was like a double curved bow. And that was a very unusual shape of a bow for a native tribe. I had never seen that shape before with an American Indian tribe. And I've seen a lot of bows and arrows. So I asked him, I said, this seems unusual. I've not seen this before. In Oklahoma, every native tribe, the bows would look like a single bow or just a single curve. I said, this is quite extraordinary, especially as far back as this tribe was. So he said, yeah, we found a lot of weapon-type artifacts that we've not seen with other tribes. And I said, well, how do you know these were Native Americans? Maybe they were from somewhere else. He said, oh, no, they were the Timucas because they're well established along the Florida and Georgia coast, and he said we got a lot of stuff in 3 or 4 states about them, and they were quite prolific at one time. So he said we know they're Native Americans. I said, well, all right, what else you got? He said, well, we got some skeletons. He said, you want to see the bones? And I said, well, yeah. That sounds. You don't get to see a skeleton very often. I said, are they where we can actually see them, or are they buried? He said, no, they're visible. So they had a burial site that they had been very respectful for when they built the museum. When they found a burial site, they didn't move the bones. They left them where they were, and they just uncovered them to where they were visible, and then they built the museum on top of it. They did basically the same thing with the museum that the Jekyll Island guys had done with their houses. They put a piece of plexiglass over the burial site so you could see it, but they were still trying to respect where the bones were and not move them. And so I'm looking at 4 skeletons of the Timucua chiefs. And they knew they were chiefs just from different things that were buried with them. So all of a sudden I look and I realize, man, these guys are really tall. And I commented to the guy that, how tall are these guys? They look unusually large. And he said, yeah, they're all about 8 or 8.5 foot tall. I thought, well, that doesn't seem like a normal Native American, especially the tribes that I'm familiar with. He said all the Timucas were unusually tall, even the women. He said we found other skeletons and parts of bones out in the grounds, and he said we've got pretty good evidence that nearly all of them were extraordinarily tall. And I said, well, what is, how do you explain that in relation to other tribes on the Atlantic coast who were not? He said, I don't know. It is an unusual anomaly. He said, oh, by the way, I've got a painting that you might want to see. It's actually the copy of the original. We've got it under lock and key. But he said, I got a painting that actually shows the Indians from a group of French colonists that came to the United States before it was the U.S. This was right after Columbus. He said that it was the first colony of French folks that came over to try to establish a colony on the coast. And he said they landed in Jekyll Island, and they had some interaction with these Indians, and then they got so appalled by what they saw and witnessed that they fled at night and ended up in San Augustine, Florida, and established that city. So I said, were they the Huguenots who were the French group that established San Augustine? He said, yes. I said, well, I'd like to see that painting then. So he pulls that out. I'm looking at it, and it shows the Indians and all their regalia, and they're dancing around and having some kind of a ceremony, and it's got the fire, and it's a typical, either they're having a party or they're having a war scene, and it has some things with the weapons. So I said, gosh, this has got some weapons in it that clearly validates the archaeology that they found. And then I see an altar. And I'm going, I don't know of a Native American tribe anywhere in the country. I know some that had log houses or high places or worshipped, nature in some way or had totem poles or that kind of stuff. But this one has a stone altar, and it looks a whole lot like the one that I had dealt with in the Middle East. And I'm looking at the picture, and I'm going, is this an altar? Is this stone like something they're sacrificing on? Because this guy's holding babies in his hands in this picture. He said, yeah, they're cutting those babies, they're hacking those babies up in that painting. And so when you look at the details, two of the shamans or chiefs are holding a baby up by the ankles, and they're whacking their heads off and spilling the blood on this altar. Mm. And I'm like, sir, I don't want to be disrespectful of your training and archaeological understanding and history, but I don't know of any native tribe that did what I'm seeing here, unless it was an act of war. And this is really, really unusual. And I've seen this type of scene with artifacts over in the Middle East. And I've seen weapons like this over in the Middle East. I said, are you sure this is Native Americans and not some kind of colony that came from over there? And he was convinced they were Native. And I said, well, I'd like to show you some things on a few websites that identify artifacts in the Middle East countries, and especially Egypt and Israel and Syria and Jordan area, and some of those spots where there's some of these ancient groups. And I said, this type of altar, this type of religious ceremony, and some of these weapons, I've seen them before over there. Well, he was quite interested in that because he loves Native American history, but he's starting to question, maybe I need to dig into this more. That was his comment. So I said, at that point, then I thought, I believe this is why I'm here. I needed to see this and hear about this. At this point, I'm not that concerned about the financial stuff anymore. I'm wanting to know, where is this altar? And so I asked him, I said, can you take me to this altar? I often pray over these things, and it's very beneficial for the land and for the country and for the people. Can I go to this altar and see it? He said, I can take you to the altar, but you can't see it. And I said, why can't I see it? Is it buried? He said, no, it's not buried, but it has a house built on top of it. I said, who would be crazy enough to build their house on top of a blood sacrifice altar? He said, well, Rockefeller was. So,
nice.
I just okay. Can we go there? And he said, yeah, it's just a short walk. Come on. And we've actually, had already walked by it. So he said, I've got the keys. He said, normally nobody can go in. The way these things are set up, they're historical homes now. The state of Georgia owns the park. They lease out to another group, the hotel, to run, but the houses are maintained on the National Historical Register, and they're part of the state park. So you can't go in any of them without a guided tour or permission, but you can go look in the windows and walk on the porches and walk all around them. And they're set up inside just like they were when they were actually being used back in the 20s and earlier. So we go over there, and he's got the keys, though. So we go into the house, and he takes me into the parlor. And he says, well, I know you're a praying guy, so you probably would like to have a little time to pray. He said, you're standing right on top of the altar right now. This is the room that is built on top of it. He said, I'm just going to go over here and sit down for a few minutes and read the newspaper, and I'll let you pray and do whatever you need to do.
Now, this parlor, that's where those guys, J.P. Morgan and all those guys, actually conceived of the Federal Reserve, right? Right over that altar.
That's exactly right. It's the room that they were sitting in when they drew up the entire legislation and plan to pass it that became the Federal Reserve Act.
Wow.
So this was the conception of the Federal Reserve banking system on the parlor sitting on top of a blood sacrifice altar.
Where babies were sacrificed.
Yes. And so all of a sudden it's like, wow, no wonder our banking system has so much corruption in it, even when people want to do the right thing,
No kidding.
And so, just being a banker is not an easy job, but it's like, not all of them are bad guys, but it's like, wow. And that was not what our founders set up. That took over. It usurped the authority of the way our founding fathers suggested that we bank as a country. And even the way it was passed had a lot of, things that didn't seem right about it. But the idea that it was conceived like this, I'm going, this is not just a bunch of wealthy guys that got away for a vacation and came up with a profitable business plan. This has got something diabolical, something occultic about it, something evil that's wrapped up with it.
Yeah.
And so even if it had been a good idea and something beneficial for the country, which many would argue that it was, this demonic power must have gotten into it, because they didn't just create a bank, they created a banking system that every one of us have become subject to. So think about this. We've got a piece of money that wouldn't be of any value whatsoever if we didn't attribute value to it. Our dollars are only worth something because they're measured against something else. And the problem worldwide is every nation is operating with fiat currency, and we're the ones that taught them how to do it. The change that the Federal Reserve did was not just to change the facial picture on the money. What they did is they took the right that our Constitution gave to the Treasury Department to print the money and set the value thereof. And they said, let us print it for you, and then we'll loan it back to you.
Right.
Think about the stupidity of that. If you just think
crazy.
wisely, I'm already making something with my own hands, and then somebody else comes to me and says, let me make that for you, and then I'll loan it back to you.
At interest.
Why would I do that? It's mine to start with. I don't need you to print it for me and then charge me interest to have it. But that's what we did. We set that up on a national scale, and where was the voice of the righteous when that happened? Why was there not a public outcry? It forces us to have debt, or we have no economy.
Yeah.
You cannot buy anything in this country without a debt being created, because if you buy something, that's the reason they print $1. So
right.
You buy a house and you ask for a loan, they print the money so they can give you the loan. That creates debt whether you are borrowing or not. Every sale, every transaction, every exchange has to create a debt now to be done. So that is not necessary, but it is something we chose to allow.
And unfortunately, due to technical difficulties, the show cut off right about this point in the broadcast.
My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. My published work is available on Amazon. My books make a great gift. If you'd like to support my work, you can do that through patreon.com. There should be a link in the description section for those who are interested. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. Please hit the like button and subscribe for future updates. As always, I look forward to reading your thoughts, so kindly leave a comment below. Please have a wonderful weekend, and I hope to see you again soon.